Well, our title today, The Root Cause of Student Debt, Unaccountable Prices. We're going to be going at the unaccountable. We didn't like the fact that the title actually answered the question before we had the panel. So we're going to take a long way around discussing this and sort of talk about some of the ways that high prices have impacted higher education, eventually why they have occurred, but more what can we do about them, and what are the solutions that people are poking around the edges of right now. My name is Kerry Healey. I am, among other things, a former college president. I was president of Babson College for about 6 years. And so I got to see up close how the prices are made, so how the sausage is made of the cost of higher education. And I certainly agree that part of it is a response to the availability of loans, both private loans and public loans. And so I think one of the things that we'd like to do a deep dive into today is how that public funding, which is very well intentioned and was certainly intended to help even the playing field for lower income students who needed college educations in order to be economically and socially mobile. How has that actually played out for them? And so I'd like to start with Lindsey. We have Lindsey here from the Heritage Foundation. And Lindsey, you've spent a lot of time researching the history of federal loans and how they came into being, what their purpose was. Give us a little bit of background and set the stage for the discussion.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. I'm happy to be here. And, I do think it's important to do a really quick history of federal involvement in the higher ed financing space. And I think you really have to go back to Sputnik launching, right? I mean, we talk about this a lot, but we see the Soviets launch the Sputnik satellite. 2 weeks later, actually, they launched Sputnik 2. And of course, this led to the space race. This led to Eisenhower signing into law the National Defense Education Act, because we thought at the time, more scientists, more mathematicians. There was a national security imperative. But what we see really quickly is that gives way to a much broader federal intervention in higher education. We see, of course, the next administration, the Johnson administration, come in and launch its war on poverty. And so we move from fighting this international war with the Soviets, a Cold War, to all of a sudden trying to fight a domestic war on poverty. And 1/3 of that war on poverty was education-based. And a big part of that was the Higher Education Act. So we get the HEA in 1965, the goal of which, one goal, was to improve access for low-income individuals to attend college. And so that was really the genesis of the HEA. What we see, though, as with every other aspect of ed policy that was part of that war on poverty, was that this beginning of federal intervention in higher ed really did lay the groundwork for massive federal subsidies that had the exact opposite effect of what was initially intended by proponents. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, I know, but massive increases in federal subsidies ultimately leading to significant increases in college costs that were most detrimental to low-income Americans.
So let's tease that out a little bit for people who haven't really thought about this thoroughly from the standpoint of a college institution. So you're an institution of higher education. You have been, let's say in the 1960s, traditionally a very elite institution. People who had college educations, that really was considered to be unusual. And suddenly you're under pressure to admit people who are poorer. And so how are you going to do that without cutting costs in some way, or getting more financial aid, so more donations from your alumni, or they can just have loans and they can come. And so suddenly, poor students become actually a source of revenue for these higher ed institutions, and there's suddenly a proliferation of higher ed institutions in order to meet that new need for educating poorer students. And so how is that? I'd like to go to Preston now, who's here with FREOPP, and I'd like to just ask you, how has that proliferation of private education actually served poorer students?
Thanks, Kerry. So, I think you touch on a really important point. Is say we talk a lot about the price side of this equation. So, there's a number of studies showing that increases in federal aid, colleges are going to capture some of that and use that to raise tuition. But I think we also need to talk about what happens on the other side. What happens when students get out of school? Do they even finish school? And we need to talk about the value side of that equation. When the federal student loan program was introduced, when Pell Grants were introduced, I think you saw a lot of policymakers take a look at the data on earnings by education and say, oh, look, well, people with a bachelor's degree earn about 60% more than people with only a high school degree. Let's just send everybody to college and we can increase national income by 60%. It'll be great. But it turns out that 60% average masks a whole lot of variation, and that there are some programs out there which take a lot of students' money but don't really put them on a sound financial footing, don't really equip them with skills that are going to enable them to get a good job. And there are a lot of schools out there which don't graduate a majority of their students at all. There are a number of colleges receiving federal aid that have 10, 20, 30% graduation rates. And so it turns out that when we plow all this money into higher education without actually paying attention to what kind of outcomes we're getting from that, we end up leaving a lot of students in a worse position than when they started.
And is part of your study, you've looked at what, 30,000 different college programs, different majors and concentrations and in different institutions. And how variable is the return on investment between various programs and different colleges?
So we did a study about a year ago, but looking at 30,000 different bachelor's degree programs. And basically what we did is we estimated how much is this degree going to boost your earnings over your lifetime? And then we compared that to what are the costs and risks of college? What are you going to pay in tuition? Do you have to spend time out of the labor force to get that degree? You're going to be giving up earnings. Is there a big risk of non-completion? I mentioned before, a lot of colleges don't have very high graduation rates. And so what we found is that there are 28% of programs that on average leave their students worse off financially than when they started. But there are also about 20% of programs that increase their students' lifetime earnings net of college costs by about $500,000 or more. Mm-hmm. So there's a huge amount of variation. And I think, we ask the question sometimes, whether college is worth it or not. And we really need to drill down and look at, when is college worth it? Because we're talking about an extremely heterogeneous industry here, and it really matters not only what institution but what field of study you're choosing.
Yeah, and I believe that we use the word college or we use the word university to address so many different things. We use it for Ivy League institutions, we use it for the broad middle ground of private institutions, we use it for all the public institutions, and then we use it for community colleges as well, and many colleges that are even for profit. And so the idea that we would have one measure and say college is good and college is good for everyone, language is really doing us a disservice here.
Absolutely. So higher education it's an extremely diverse landscape. You have, short-term certificate programs that might be 6 months or less, and then you have PhD programs. But we actually looked at ROI for those other kinds of programs too, those certificates, associate's degrees, master's degrees. And it turns out there's a lot of variation there too. If you go to a community college and you get a certificate in, say, licensed practical nursing, that certificate is probably going to pay off. That's going to put you on the career ladder. But then if you go and get an associate's degree in, say, liberal arts or general studies, that is going to be put you on a much less sound financial footing going forward.
Okay, well, I want to come back and drill down a little bit on that. But before that, I'd love to go to you, Jason, and just ask you a little bit about your work. You look at the impact of loans. Are loans a good thing?
Well, okay, yeah. So the original idea around student loans, right, for the government being involved in student loans, and I think this is partly still intact, which I think is also why there actually isn't a huge appetite for getting rid of them. And it's that now, this is notwithstanding President Biden's most recent extra legal actions, but they're actually pretty cheap from a policy standpoint for the government, which is why policymakers have reached for them. it buys a lot of college access for the government, and which is the goal.
And it is assumed that that's a good, that's
right,
an unalloyed good,
that's
right?
That's
so,
right. Right.
Despite what Preston is telling us
and
here.
So this is partly what, and I say this because this is partly what like folks that are critics of student loans are kind of up against this, because when people get elected to Congress and they show up and they realize that student loans are just not really that expensive in the budget, but there's a lot of college access, so it's like $100 billion in loans each year. And it doesn't cost that much. And so, I think that's I think that always has to kind of be on the table in these conversations, and you could say like, college access, good, bad, and some of this doesn't pay off. But I think that's a major, it's a major hurdle. And I think that's, why policymakers use student loans in the first place and not grants.
Okay,
right?
so let's combine the discussion with your discussion with Preston's discussion a little bit. Ought we to be looking at loans? Ought the federal government be looking at loans that are somehow calibrated to return on investment, or perhaps even the demand in our society for particular jobs? So, for example, you were talking about nurses. Nursing certificates seem to pay off. We always have a nursing shortage. Should we just have federal loans for nurses, for example, or the like?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a little bit of a trap for conservatives, and I know Lindsey will back me up on this. And I've been in the room with lawmakers where they go down this path of, sort of saying, well, these ones pay off and these don't. And it quickly starts to look like a sort of Medicare fee schedule for higher education, right? Where it's sort of like lawmakers say, I know what pays off. I'm going to pick winners and losers. I know what pays off and I know it doesn't. And I just think that's a dangerous place for conservatives, because it leads to this sort of command and control and very prescriptive. And I mean, honestly, I've worked on Capitol Hill. I don't have a whole lot of confidence in lawmakers to pick the right ones.
Okay, so Lindsey's nodding a lot, so I want to get her in there. And there's only one microphone, so she can't really interrupt.
Jump in.
Yes.
No,
okay.
I was just going to say, now if Jason put a suit on, he could come work at Heritage. So would be. But no, I mean, I think you're right. The fallacy of thinking we have some all-knowing central planners in Washington that can determine what a good ROI will be on a particular field down the road is a fallacy. But I also think that it's the reason why we need to get the federal government out of the student loan business altogether, because the private sector could make that determination. It would be appropriate for them to do so. It would be appropriate for them, and they used to do this, to set interest rates according to what they think that ROI would be. And so, if you take grad lending, I think this is the one area where there's probably widespread agreement, I think, on ending the Grad Plus program, in particular, the whole of the Plus program. But if you think about grad student loans, there is no justification for the federal taxpayer to subsidize graduate loans. And that's for two reasons. Either you are a student who's going to attend medical school or law school or pursue some other professional degree, and you will have no problem in the free market getting a loan at a competitive interest rate. And so therefore, it shouldn't be up to the federal taxpayer. Or you're a student who is pursuing grad school to study, I don't know what, fill in the blank, women's studies always gets picked on. Oh, now it's gender studies. So you're going to get a PhD in gender studies. Well, you're going to get a terrible ROI in the free market. And that's another reason the federal taxpayer shouldn't be on the hook for it. So for both instances, both types of borrower, whether it's the person who will get a good ROI or the person who may not, I think there's a good argument that the federal taxpayer should not be on the hook for subsidizing those loans.
Okay, so can I push back a little bit and just say, but why shouldn't a poorer student have the same opportunity to go study philosophy or French literature or whatever it is, as would a wealthier student?
Yeah, and they would. There are, and Jason can probably speak to this better than me, but a lot of innovative ways to think about how we finance higher ed that would take into account the lower income student, but their prospects down the road, backward looking and forward looking measures for lenders in the private sector to consider. So backward looking measures, how good were you as a student in your high school days? How strong was your GPA? Et cetera, et cetera. Forward-looking measures. What are you studying? How likely are you to be able to repay that loan? So the low-income student in a market, in a loan market, I don't think it's going to be disadvantaged the way that we often portray them to be if the federal taxpayer is no longer on the hook for it.
Preston?
So I think I'm very much directionally with Lindsey on this. I think we're doing way too much in the federal student loan space. There are areas like graduate and parent lending where it should absolutely be privatized. The federal government has no business making effectively unlimited loans to graduate programs. This has enabled things like Columbia University to offer a $180,000 master's degree in film that ends up getting people about $30,000 in income when they graduate. I'm not sure if I go all the way to say we should also privatize the undergraduate loan program, although recent actions by a certain president who shall remain nameless have pushed me more in Lindsey's direction on that one. But I do want to talk a little bit about how we decide which kinds of programs are going to get loans right now, because it's not just a free-for-all. I mean, if you're a college and you want to get loans from the federal government, you have to be accredited, which has all sorts of requirements on it. Your program has to be a certain number of credit hours, and these things are all based around inputs. They say, okay, we think we know how to design a good educational program, and so we're going to require you to meet all these benchmarks. Like, here's how you should design your curriculum. Here's how you should do your exams. Here's how many books you need to have in the library. And so I would argue that when we're deciding, which programs are going to be eligible to participate in the federal loan program, we should instead be looking at outcomes. We should be looking at, is this a program where the majority of students are paying down their loans? If most students are not even able to cover interest on their loan payments, maybe that's a program we shouldn't lend to in the future. I mean, there's always going to have to be some sort of guardrails around which kinds of programs are going to be eligible for federal aid.
Isn't that tantamount to picking winners and losers?
No, because it's entirely based on outcomes. So if you have a philosophy program but you're really going to invest in career services and you're going to make sure your graduates get jobs and can pay down your loans, you should be able to get federal aid. If you have an engineering program but your students don't show up to class, they don't graduate, and they can't pay back their loans, we should look at that. We should look at the fact that students in that program are not paying back their loans, and that program should no longer be eligible. So we can put guardrails around the federal loan program without actually resorting to central planning if we actually look at the track record of these programs and whether students are able to pay back their loans.
Okay, so I want to come back to Jason. Jason, I'd like to back up just a little bit. Explain to us why there are different schemes for undergraduate loans and graduate loans. What makes them different, and should they be different?
And a really important point we haven't really put on the table yet is that undergraduate loans are subject to caps. So Congress has put caps in place, and they range from $5,500 a year to $12,500 a year. And they actually haven't changed since 2008. So they've been fixed. No inflation adjustments, nothing. On the graduate side, the loans are unlimited. It's whatever the institution charges, you can borrow that. And you can borrow for the full cost of attendance. So those are completely.
So that means room and board. Childcare.
Childcare is factored into the cost of attendance. Right. Yeah. So
it's defined by the institution.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think and so the graduate space is just basically, and we talk a lot about accountability, and a lot of the accountability and quality assurance conversations have been focused on the undergraduate side. And I think that, ironically, we have these very liberal lending policies on the graduate side, but it's also where there's a sentiment that graduate school is elite and special, and it can sort of take care of itself. Right? We don't need to have policies of quality assurance around graduate education. And so we have unlimited lending and very little appetite for doing quality assurance or any kind of guardrails like Preston was talking about on the graduate side. And I actually think that's where there's this sort of ticking time bomb in terms of sort of, lots of borrowing for sort of marginal quality programs.
Yes, Lindsey.
I just wanted to add to Jason's ticking time bomb, because to add onto that, now we have IDR that has gotten more and more generous, right? These income-driven repayments. The Biden administration just made that incredibly generous. It was already generous, but prior to the recent changes, you were capped at paying, 5% of your discretionary income monthly on your student loans. If you qualified, now it's 10% of your discretionary income. We hear so much about the myriad problems with federal student loan forgiveness, and it's a huge problem. But
so say exactly what that means. So how might that impact for example, let's say, what's the highest value loan you could get, and when might you be repaying that?
So you could imagine a student who decides to attend law school, takes out $220,000 in graduate loans, decides they're going to go into public service, doesn't make a ton of money, gets their payment capped that they have to pay monthly at now 10% of their discretionary income, and then has their student loan forgiven, the principal and interest of it forgiven before they ever pay a penny on the principal. So there's the financial side of it, but there's also just the moral hazard side of everything that we've heard around student loan forgiveness lately. The proposals that are out there. I mean, why would you ever now save for college as a parent for your child? Why would you plan to repay a penny of your student loan as a borrower? Why would you not borrow the maximum amount possible moving forward because you're confident that your student loans will also be forgiven in the future? And you have a good argument to make, right? I mean, why this particular cohort? Why not subsequent cohorts moving forward?
So what's the argument against this sort of income-driven repayment program? Now, you think that perhaps the income levels at which these loans become non-payable is too low. But what if it were higher? Like, is it a bad idea in general, or is it just being implemented poorly?
You can't have both income-driven repayment and student loan forgiveness on the back end. I think that's where we're getting into a lot of trouble, where you have a situation where the payments are capped, but then 20 years from now or 10 years from now, if you go into government work, your loans are forgiven. When you have both of those in play, then you end up with a large swath of people who are never pay down their loans. And of course, none of this is free, right? This is all on the backs of American taxpayers.
So Preston, talk about how this impacts, for example, people going to community college or people getting one of those certificates that you were talking about for technical skills.
Yeah. So the Biden changes to income-based repayment. There's the cut in the percentage of income you're going to pay, but there's also an increase in the amount of income that's exempt from those assessments under income-based repayment. So he moved it up from 150% of the poverty line, which is around $22,000, to about 225% of the poverty line, which is about $30,000 a year. So if you graduate from community college with a 2-year degree or a certificate, and you're in a job where you're making, say, $27,000, $30,000 a year, which is normal for a lot of programs, you will actually not make a single payment on your loans until they're forgiven. That program, whatever you paid, that's essentially free. Whatever you paid and used loans to do is essentially free. So from the student's perspective, the rational thing to do here is to borrow the maximum federal student loan you're eligible for. From the college's perspective, the rational thing to do is to raise your prices by whatever the amount of the loan is. Tell your students, hey, you should go borrow the maximum student loan because you're going to get it all forgiven, or you're going to have to make very small payments and then get the rest forgiven. The ironic thing here is that this new income-based repayment plan, which is intended to make student debt more affordable, is really going to just cement the role of federal student debt in our education system, including in sectors where debt wasn't a big part before.
So how does this, and this is for any of you, how does this differ than making community college free?
I think it differs from making community college free in that you also have this debt on paper, which is eventually going to be forgiven. But the ironic thing here is that, when you talk to student borrowers, they're concerned about their monthly payment, but they're also concerned about the amount of debt that they have. And they're concerned about making payments on their loans and never seeing the balance go down, like throwing money into the fire. So ironically, Biden has made community college free, but he hasn't actually solved any of the political problems with student loans, because students are still going to carry this debt, and they're still going to look at it and say, why do I have all this debt? Can we forgive it again?
Yeah. So Jason, how are you looking at this? Would you support these kinds of income share agreements?
Well, I mean, so to go back to your earlier question on this, income-based repayment, the idea was supposed to be a safety net. So people take on loans and their income is either temporarily low. And these were all the original arguments, like temporarily low, and so they can pay based on their income. And then the loan forgiveness piece of it was this sort of like afterthought. Someone was like, well, what if it's really bad? And you never really earn that much money. Like, well, okay, I guess we could have loan forgiveness. And the original term was like 25 years, so clearly a safety net. But what the Biden administration is doing, and this is through a plan they can enact without further legislation from Congress. They plan to implement it sometime next year. We have the loose details from a press release. It's great when policy is made with just press releases out of the White House, but here we are. And I mean, Preston is not exaggerating the change that's being made to the program. I mean, it is absolutely transformational for the higher education sector, and I think not in a good way. I think it will, loans. I think before, especially on the undergraduate side, loans were a bit of a gamble, right? In terms of like, well, I'll take it, but I probably have to pay it back, and with interest, right? But now it's going to flip it, where you probably won't have to pay it back. You probably have to make very small payments on the loan. You should probably take them.
So let's step back for a second and just have a philosophical debate. I'm from Massachusetts, and our Constitution is the oldest continuously operating democracy in the world. And it was written by John Adams. And one of the things that he included was public education. And the reason he did that was because of the need for educated citizenry to participate in democracy. And so at that time, unless you were wealthy, unless you had some advantages, if you're a landowner, you really didn't have an education. And he knew that if he was going to found a democracy, you needed to suddenly educate people, poorer people who had never had access to that before. So we talk a lot about the importance of having a robust democracy today. And do we now look at, so here's the question, do we look at higher education as a public good or a personal benefit? Is it a private benefit or a public good? Let's let the heritage start there. Yes. Okay. Oh well.
I was going to give the controversial take that I'm not sure it's helping democracy and higher ed writ large, and a lack of free speech and free expression and everything else, but that's another topic. I mean, look, there's rationale for K-12 education to be publicly financed. It's the case in all 50 states across the country. I think we have a much harder case to be made that it holds true in the higher ed space, which is why historically it hasn't been. It's a private good by and large, and I think a lot of Preston's work showing that if you look at different job sectors across the country that now require a college degree that did not used to require a college degree, but that those jobs have not become any more difficult over that same time period, is a good indication that it is in fact just a private good and not something that is necessarily a good for the broader public. So yeah, I mean, certainly not a case for large-scale public subsidies.
I would definitely agree with Lindsey, and I would say I would draw a bright line between K-12 education and post-secondary education. More than 90% of kids will graduate from high school, and I think that if you want to have broad-based civics education to make sure people are informed voters who can support democracy, that's the kind of thing you want to do in high school. But then when we get to the post-secondary education side, we have an extremely complicated, diverse economy with a lot of different labor needs, and therefore post-secondary education has to be extremely diverse. And so you can't really have any kind of, standard good citizen education in post-secondary education because it's going to be so different. You're going to have apprenticeships. You're going to have short-term certificates in community colleges. You're going to have traditional four-year degrees. You're going to have PhDs. A very wide variety of post-secondary education that's I don't think should be standardized. If you have these aspects of education where you want general education for to be a good citizen, that's the kind of thing you should do in K-12.
Jason, public good?
Yeah,
private benefit?
I think what's interesting about the public good argument is it used to be the thing that I can't figure out with the public good argument is it seems to be used most often now to justify degrees that don't pay off in terms of their earnings. Right, and I'm not quite sure. And it used to be that it was progressives and people on the left saying education is a public good, that we should therefore subsidize it. But it is also progressives and folks on the left, particularly starting with the Obama administration, who said we need to collect earnings data and measure whether or not these degrees pay off. And I'm still trying to figure out which is it, right? It seems like a little bit of a I'll people say, the progressives particularly say, well, I'll pick and choose as I want.
Okay, so I think we have about 5 minutes left. We can take some questions from the audience. Yes.
It does seem like from a quick skim of the total amount of debt outstanding, something happened like 20 years ago, like the explosion.
1.7 trillion in outstanding debt. 1.7 trillion.
The compound growth rate like ticked up in the early aughts. Like what happened? Like what was going on in the 90s and then why did it go up?
Yeah, can we share this? So, I mean, I think a big part of it's grad lending because the Grad Plus program didn't exist until 2006, right? So you couldn't, at the federal level, borrow an unlimited amount of money for grad school until the early 2000s. And we know that grad debt is the largest proportion. It's half. It's 48%. Right. So that's it, I think. Is there another?
Yeah, and I would add, the rise of income-based repayment plans in the during the Obama administration. These means that you're making smaller monthly payments on your loans, which means you're going to pay down your principal faster. So, it's kind of like if student debt is a bathtub, you've stuffed a dish rag in the drain, so it's draining out slower. At the same time, you've turned the tap on higher. So yeah, it's both the repayment plans and the new lending, especially on the grad side.
There's also a little bit of a demographic factor here. There were, during the Great Recession, a lot of people went back to school or went to school for the first time who were older, and those people took out loans. So we sort of brought in a new group of people who weren't taking out loans before.
And I would actually add that there has been inflation in terms of job requirements over time. So not only was there this whole discussion of the American dream, which included having a college education, but then soon employers found that just putting that requirement of a college education on their job descriptions meant that they had to do less work. And especially as people were dealing with large numbers of resumes, it just made it easier to go through. And it's been estimated that, some large proportion, maybe 30% or more of jobs that actually require a college education don't actually require a college education. It just would make it easier to sort for things like, do you get up in the morning? Do you do your work? Do you have a certain amount of socialization, et cetera, which are things that you could find out in person if you did the interview instead. So yes, in the back.
Yeah. So you guys have talked a lot about financing demand for bachelor's degree, but what about, are there any ways that maybe we could expand the definition of what a bachelor's degree entails so that and they do this in Europe, they integrate degrees with the job. So it's basically like you work as part of an apprenticeship program, and then at the end you get a bachelor's degree, just like you went to school, but you work the whole time. So could we is there policy levers in the United States that could maybe encourage that more?
Yeah, I mean, I'll defer to Preston, I think, but accreditation reform is a really important component of that, allowing new accreditation models that would actually reflect that type of arrangement.
Yeah, I think one of them is, the American Medical Association, which hasn't approved a new medical school since God knows when. But, if you look at certain European countries, like I believe Switzerland is one of them, you don't actually have to get a bachelor's degree before you go to medical school. You just go straight from your secondary education into med school. They teach you, organic chemistry and all the stuff you need in the first couple of years. And that means that students are getting through medical school much quicker. They're spending less, they're taking out less debt, and they're able to get into the economy, and heal people much faster than they are in the United States. So those are the kinds of innovations that I think we need to bring here.
When faced with $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, plus unsustainable costs of tuition, plus what you were saying, Lindsey, about lack of free speech in universities and teaching anti-American and anti-Western civilization agendas, and kids getting mediocre outcomes, and the availability of online courses, is there going to be some kind of reckoning where 10 years from now, 20 years from now, we're going to have a completely different model and the college as we know it today won't exist anymore?
That was a really good burn it all to the ground case that you made. So thanks for making that case. Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I do think it gets back to your point earlier about the proportion of employers or jobs that now require a degree that didn't 30 years ago. I would like to think that we would get to a point among some in the hiring sphere that it's almost an anti-credential, right? And you went to college, well, we're going to move you to the side. And so, but you know, we're a long ways off, I think, at the moment, at least, from actually moving away from the bachelor's degree as a proxy of employability. And part of the problem is student loan debt forgiveness, right? Which I am loath to even call it that, right? It's debt amnesty that we're shifting on to all American taxpayers. But this debt amnesty is only going to make it easier and easier to continue down this path and not make some structural and fundamental changes that we need to make.
If I can use my privilege a little bit to, as moderator, to jump in there, I have been long predicting that there will be a shakeout, especially among mid-range private higher education, where once return on investment becomes a term that parents and students alike understand and can actually gauge their choices, where they go, what kind of debt they take out to do that, and certainly anything that linked interest rates to, or even accessibility of financial aid to ROI would be a benefit for all of society, honestly. So, but it would put many, many colleges out of business entirely. And so I predict consolidations. I do think that there will be pressure from institutions like Southern New Hampshire or Arizona State or Western Governors University, that in Western Governors you can get through the entire program with it costing maybe $30,000. It's online. It's very good. They're currently supporting 17% of all nurses in the U.S. came from Western Governors. And so they've proven that you can have a lower cost model, and eventually it will break this this model that we've had now for more than 50 years, which is really an elite model that we're trying to shoehorn a broader population in. So thank you to my panelists. I know they could have talked all day, and we would have loved to have listened to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.